Hey class, I'm coming to you today through the magic of video from the world headquarters of Joplin Consulting Group in beautiful Owasso, Oklahoma. And in this video, we're going to be covering chapter 2 from your textbook, which discusses how do we do analysis of the external environment of companies. And so I'm going to share my screen with you and we'll go through the materials. All right, you should be able to see my screen now. So chapter 2, analyzing the external environment of the firm. As always, when we're going through any particular chapter or case, make sure that you've mastered the learning objectives because that's the material that's most likely to be on the exam because it's most important, right? So after mastering the material in this chapter, you should understand the importance of developing forecasts. Why do we do that? Why do we take the time and invest all the effort into creating forecasts? If you don't already know, you're gonna learn about what environmental scanning, environmental monitoring, and competitive intelligence are, and why those are effective inputs into creating an accurate forecast. We'll talk about scenario planning, and then we're gonna look at two different ways of framing the environment. We're gonna look at the general environment, which is a lot of things going on outside of the firm, like the economy and technology and what is the government doing through legislation, that type of thing, demographics. We'll also look at the competitive environment, what's going on among competitors that affects the company. And then we'll finish up by talking about this concept called strategic groups and understand how we can use that as a tool to look at the external environment. And so your authors start out by pointing out that managers who are successful have something called perceptual acuity. Perceptual acuity. And so if you've read the chapter, what is perceptual acuity? If you had to put that in English in your own words, how would you describe perceptual acuity? I put it this way. Perceptual acuity is just the ability to see things that are likely to happen before they happen. In fact, your authors have defined it as the ability to sense what's coming before the fog clears. We see that sometimes in athletes, right? Basketball players or football players who, regardless of their athletic ability, they just have like a sixth sense that they can see how the play is getting ready to develop before it does, and they can run to where the ball is going to be. And so managers who are successful, strategic managers, have that type of skill. They have this perceptual acuity. They're the type of people that before Uber or Airbnb were able to sense that there might be an opportunity there. Just a couple of weeks ago, I was in Chicago and I saw one of the Carvana vending machines. That's just crazy to me that there's vending machines for automobiles, right? But somebody had the perceptual acuity to see that and make it happen. So your authors talk about three different types of inputs into forecasts: environmental scanning, environmental monitoring, and competitive intelligence. And environmental scanning and environmental monitoring sound pretty similar. That can get confusing. And so let me explain what the difference is. So I think environmental scanning, this first definition here, is like a snapshot. If you were to take just a snapshot of the environment as it is today, a snapshot, a still photo, that's the idea of environmental scanning. You take the snapshot of the way things are and uses that to predict things that are likely to happen in the future. Environmental monitoring looks at trends, and so it's more like a video, right? Where environmental scanning is like a still photo, environmental monitoring is like looking at a video to see not just how things are today, but what the trend is over the past few years or a decade, and what does that mean for the future. So an example of environmental scanning would be is we could look at the prime rate as of the day that I'm recording this video is 8.5%. Prime rate's 8.5%. Okay, that's useful information, but is it trending up or down? If you look at the trend, then you know that the prime rate today of 8.5% is the highest it's been in over 20 years. The last time it was prime rate was over 8.5%, I think, was in January 2000, around that time. So over 20 years ago. So understand the difference between environmental scanning and environmental monitoring. Competitive intelligence, you probably have some idea of what that is. It's, kind of being a sleuth or a detective and going out and figuring out what are the competitors doing? What are they doing that we should be aware of that might signal where they're heading? Maybe give us some indication of how we should respond. So just a quick story. When I worked for Intuit in Texas, we had, I guess for lack of a better word, fake accounts set up with all of our major competitors, Wolters Kluwer and PPC and the different software developers, under the name of just, something like Bob's Tax Service or something like that. And we would get copies of their software and all their marketing materials and that type of thing. And then we would backwards engineer their software and see what features they're adding. We'd look at their marketing materials and see what they're marketing and what they're telling their customers. And so we would gather competitive intelligence to better understand how we at Intuit could position ourselves to have an advantage over our competitors. All that's fine and good. Competitive intelligence is completely ethical. Your organization should engage in competitive intelligence, but you have to understand that you can drift over into gray areas. One time while I was working at Intuit, they asked me to attend a user conference of one of our competitors. There was a user conference of Wolters Kluwer, whose logo you see here on this slide, and it was in Phoenix, Arizona, at a super nice resort, really expensive. They wined and dined us, but anyway, I went, my real name, Toby Joplin, but as an employee of this fictitious CPA firm that was set up with Wolters Kluwer on their records, like Jim's Tax Service or something like that. So I go out there and I'm at the reception the first evening, and of course the Wolters Kluwer people are there whining and dining us, and so they come up and they go, "So tell me about your firm. How many 1040 returns do you prepare?" That's a little awkward because we don't really prepare 1040 returns. It's a fake account. Well, how many partnership returns? How many corporate returns? Do you guys do bookkeeping? Do you do audits? And so it was a little awkward, right? And so it should have been a really cool week for me to spend at this super nice resort, eating great food, and they gave us lots of swag and expensive swag. It wasn't like the cheap stuff you get at career fairs, but it was really uncomfortable for me because I was in a position while I was at that user conference where I had to be less than honest. And so I didn't like it, and I didn't volunteer to do that again. So my point is, competitive intelligence can be done ethically. Most companies of any size that are involved in strategy engage in competitive intelligence, but you just have to decide as an organization where you're going to draw the line on what's ethical for your company and what's not. And for me personally, as an employee, I actively engage in competitive intelligence, but I will not do it in such a way that requires me to be less than honest. So that's just me. So environmental forecasting, I think you understand the idea of creating a forecast, just, developing plausible projections about where do we think things are going in our industry, right? Not only what direction are they going, but how broad are the changes are going to be and how fast are we going to get there? So maybe you make electric vehicles, right? There's pretty strong indications that we're headed towards moving away from fossil fuels and towards electric vehicles, but how soon are we get there? That's less clear. There's some issues with batteries and charging and different issues like that, battery life, one thing and another. And so it's unclear how soon we will get to that point where most people are driving electric vehicles, right? How broad is it going to be? Is it going to be a narrow segment of people that drive electric vehicles for quite a while? Or is it going to be everybody? How intense is the competition going to be? Is it going to be a few EV companies, or is it going to be everybody? One thing that companies will do will be engage in scenario analysis. That is, they'll create different scenarios. For example, you may be working at a company and you're needing to create a strategy for the future, and you might create one strategy based on whether you merge with another company, and one scenario where you don't merge with the other company, right? And so it's interesting when you look at this forecast. Most all scenario forecasts are wrong. Let me just say that most forecasts are wrong. And so the question would be, why would you create a forecast if it's going to be wrong? Well, because creating forecasts or different scenarios, one of those scenarios is more likely to be close to the actual results that you see. And so you're better prepared to respond to the future if you created these different scenarios, forecasted different scenarios, than if you did nothing, even though they're probably going to be wrong. I like this quote from Kenneth Arrow, who is a Nobel laureate economist. He says the commanding general is well aware that forecasts are no good. However, he needs them for planning purposes, right? It's almost like funny and but yet it makes sense at some level. And just as a couple examples here on this slide of guys who were really smart that ran huge companies that were very successful at the time, who were completely wrong about their forecast. Steve Ballmer, who was the CEO of Microsoft, said there's no chance that the iPhone is going to get any significant market share. And yet, excuse me, and yet most of you watching this video probably have an iPhone in your pocket right now. Ken Olson, who is a president of Digital Equipment Corporation. You probably never heard of Digital Equipment Corporation, but it used to be one of the largest computer companies in the world. He says there's no reason for any individual to have a computer in their home. Yeah, swung and missed on that one, right? All to say, it's important to create forecasts that of different scenarios, even though we know they're not going to be perfect and some may be considerably wrong. So pretty standard process in looking at the external environment and internal environment is SWOT analysis. So when we engage in a SWOT analysis, we're just looking at the strengths, the weaknesses, and the opportunities and threats for any particular organization. And so when we're looking external, we're going to be looking at opportunities and threats. We look internal, we'll be looking at strengths and weaknesses. So when we look externally, at the opportunities and threats, we're going to be looking at the general environment and the competitive environment. So if you're not familiar with these terms, general environment and competitive environment, you're like, okay, what do you mean? Well, the general environment are just the different areas you see here on this slide. Demographics, what's going on socially, society, what's going on in politics and legislation. What are the changes in technology that may affect your company? How might changes in the economy affect your organization, and what's going on globally? So let's drill down on each one of these. So first of all, demographics include things like some of the trends we're seeing is we have an aging population. I don't know how it is where you live, but out where I live here in Owasso, they're putting in a assisted living center, seems like on every corner, because so many of the baby boomers are retiring and moving into retirement homes or assisted living. In general, we're seeing a higher level of affluence, at least here in the United States and really around the world too. And it's not all spread equally, but there's a much higher standard of living than there was 30 years ago. When the first cell phones came out, mobile phones came out, they were like huge, the size of a shoebox. They had like 30 minutes of talk time. And they were $4,000, literally $4,000. And now homeless people can have a cell phone. I used to volunteer with this nonprofit that feeds the homeless in Tulsa, and we'd go down and hand out Chick-fil-A sandwiches or Arby's sandwiches, that type of thing to the homeless. And the homeless people have cell phones. It's amazing. And so they're safer because of the rising level of affluence. And in general, we're seeing a rising level of affluence. We're seeing changes in ethnic composition. There's more migrants come to the United States, which is great. The geographic distribution of the population is changing. There's been some urban flight, people moving from the big cities to the suburbs. And something just to me personally that's concerning is we're seeing greater disparities in income levels. Used to, there was a huge middle class. There were a few very wealthy people and a few people living in poverty and a huge middle class. And what we're seeing is more that middle class dispersed to either end. More people who are millionaires and even billionaires, and also more people living in poverty. There's more people, just a stunning number of people who are receive some type of subsidies for meals in primary schools and high schools and that type of thing. And it was almost unheard of when I was a young person. So, I personally feel like those of us who have done okay, we have a responsibility to try to help those people less fortunate than us. And so this greater disparity in income levels is a significant issue, not only for us as individuals, but for the companies we work for too. What's going on in society and what's going on socially in terms of the values, beliefs, and lifestyles. Some of the more significant trends, we're seeing more women in the force. You see Lindsay Snyder here, who is she's a billionaire. This lady here in front of In-N-Out, she's the president of In-N-Out Burger, and she's a billionaire. So women are taking more leadership roles. You also see Talitha Phillips here as CEO of Claris Health. Just lots of examples of women who are leading organizations right here in the College of Business. Dean Kathy Taylor, right? She was the mayor of Tulsa, now leads the College of Business. We're seeing more temporary workers and gig workers who say, you know what, I don't want a full-time permanent job. I want just a short-term deal, or I just want a gig job that I can do when I feel like it. People in general have a greater concern for fitness and eating healthy. So you see more healthy options, and employees want a more balanced lifestyle or work-life balance. There's greater concern for the environment. And we're seeing young people in general postponing the start of their families till later in life. So used to very common, you graduated from high school, you either went to college or you didn't. But once you finished your education, you typically got married and started a family. And now more and more people are waiting, 10 or 15 years to start families. So those are all things going on in terms of the social forces that may affect us as companies. Not only how we sell, but also how we engage with our employees. But what's going on politically or in terms of legislation? You see some of the examples here. We've got huge issues with our southern border in the United States. We have made it so difficult for immigrants to come to the United States legally now that they can't wait, they can't stand to wait, and so they're flooding across our borders illegally, which creates some real security issues for the United States. I personally would like us to figure out a way to expedite legal immigration so we can, and then get a control on illegal immigration. It's a win-win when we allow more migrants into the United States. But again, just personally, I believe that we have to have some type of control and make sure that people are coming across legally. The world is just a scary place, and we can't have people coming across our borders that we don't know who they are or why they want to be here. Another thing we're seeing, especially since COVID, we have artificially forced up mandated minimum wages in many states, and we're seeing in a lot of businesses where rather than pay the higher wages, they're just automating. We saw even more of this during COVID, where they were trying to limit interaction between employees and customers. You might go into a restaurant like Chili's, and you would order at a kiosk on your table and pay at the kiosk on your table. There's a McDonald's in Fort Worth where they have cooks who are human beings, but no servers. You go in and order at a kiosk, or even if you go through the drive-up window, it drops your order down the chute, and there are no employees at that McDonald's that interact with customers at that Fort Worth McDonald's. Depending on which political parties in the White House, they either open up the Keystone Pipeline or shut it down. Open it up, shut it down. And so regardless of which side of the argument you're on in terms of the Keystone Pipeline and that type of thing, it has huge ramifications for companies to think that you may build your whole strategy around the fact that there is a Keystone Pipeline or there's not a Keystone Pipeline. And then after the next presidential election, it could be the opposite. So certainly the political and legal environment has huge ramifications. And you can think of others, but these are just a few examples. Technology is always changing. If you don't believe that, I've got some really great training videos I recorded on VHS tape I'd like to sell you. Every company is affected by technology. Some of the technologies that we're seeing that are having a significant impact here lately are artificial intelligence. It's all over the news, especially in higher ed. How do we allow students to use artificial intelligence in a way that's ethical? Genetic engineering. We have recreational space travel now. If you can write the big enough check, or your credit card has a big enough a limit, you can book a trip to outer space for recreation, for tourism. So what's going on in technology that affects your business? There's always something going on in terms of technology. The economy. has a huge effect on our organizations. Interest rates, how high is unemployment, national debt. We just in the last few years, inflation has been through the roof relative to what it's been over the last 20 years. And, so prices of a lot of things like groceries and gasoline have gone up significantly. And unfortunately, the people that hurts the worst is the people who can least afford it, right? If 100% of your paycheck goes to groceries and gasoline and rent, then the inflation hurts you a lot worse than somebody who has a lot of discretionary income. I have one client that has a resort who, when they financed the resort, it was on a variable rate interest loan, and their business model made complete sense. But now that the prime rate is at the highest it's been in 20 years, their business model no longer works because interest rates are up so much. So certainly the things going on in the economy affect us. And when we're analyzing the general environment, we want to look at that. Globally, things have a big effect. Global trade, almost, and you think about your supply chain, so many businesses get either finished products or unfinished raw materials from overseas. And if your supply chain shuts down because of tensions between countries, that's a big deal if you can't get products to sell to your customers. One of the things we're seeing is this idea of tax inversions. Maybe you've talked about that in your tax classes, but a number of companies around the world, some from the United States, have moved to other countries to save on taxes. Ireland is a popular destination for tax inversions. A number of United States companies, American companies, have relocated to Ireland because they can just save, millions and millions of dollars in taxes, and they have a responsibility to their shareholders to be good stewards. And if they can lower taxes by moving, they do. So that has a big effect. In fact, I believe on October 5th, we're going to have a live video conference call with some people from Ireland and talk about why Ireland is such a popular destination for businesses and understand that better. Because part of it's the tax inversion, but that's just a small part of it. And so we need to understand why some countries are more attractive than others for different types of businesses. And when we get to the chapter on international strategy, we'll take a deep dive on that. And all these different segments of the general environment are interrelated. You see here the authors talk about that when demographics change, that affects the economy, right? When legislation changes, that can affect different industries. When technology changes, that can have effect on economies and relationships globally. So I'm just amazed by everything that's Wi-Fi enabled now. Here you see a Wi-Fi enabled egg carton and a Wi-Fi enabled water pitcher. It's referred to generally as the Internet of Things. Everything's connected. Even at my house, I have the video surveillance system. I can check my video cameras from my phone. Our Roomba is Wi-Fi enabled, so my wife can look at her robot vacuum and see the patterns it's vacuuming on the living room floor. Why you would need to do that, I don't know. I was talking to Nathan Woolard today, and he was talking about they've got a thermos or an insulated cup that is Bluetooth enabled. So you can put into your app on your phone how much water that you would like to drink each day. And then this insulated Bluetooth thermal cup keeps track of how much water that you drink. And if you're behind on drinking water for the day, it lights up red or some color, or if it's green, if you're on track, that type of thing. So it's just crazy how how connected everything is. The digital economy, one of the cases we're going to look at, in fact, I believe it's the next case is, we're going to look at Bitcoin and that type of thing. And what's going on with that? This digital currency, that's the wild new frontier, and understanding how that affects businesses and how it can evaporate overnight. So anyway, we'll take a look at that. So we looked at the general environment. Now we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about the competitive environment. Right? The competitive environment is just the factors or industry environment that affects directly the firm's strategy. So things like our existing and potential competitors, our customers, our suppliers, the risk of substitutes, and that type of thing. And so one of the very basic models that we use in analyzing the strategy for any organization is to look at what's called Porter's Five Forces model. In fact, if you analyze a company and you don't run it through this framework of Porter's Five Forces model, I have failed as a professor. I mean, this should be practically step one. Maybe not step one, but it should be a place where you start. So Porter's Five Forces model, first of all, looking at the middle, we look at how intense is the rivalry among existing firms. And then we look at the relative power of buyers, which that's what your authors refer to as customers. Customers are buyers. What's the relative power of suppliers? What's the risk or the threat of new entrants into your industry? And what's the threat of substitutes? So let's take a look at that. So threat of new entrants. So if you have a business that sells a product or service, and it would be really easy for someone to copy, and you're making above average profits, that's going to attract competition. It has a high risk, a high threat of new entrants. So you would like to be in an industry that has barriers to entry, and some things that create barriers to entry. And you may have talked about this in your economics class or one of your other classes. Economies of scale. If you have to go big or go home, that's going to limit the number of potential new entrants. If your product is extremely differentiated, then that makes it harder for other companies to copy your product or service. If there are really high capital requirements, if you have to write a really big check to get into your industry, that's going to be a barrier to entry. If there are switching costs, right? Sometimes it's just very expensive for a customer to switch from one product or service to another. And so if there are low switching costs, it's going to be more likely there's a threat of new entrants. When I was a CFO, there are always banks courting me and offering me free tickets to concerts at the BOK Center and that type of thing, trying to get my banking business as a CFO. And I would happily accept those, but I would tell them up front, it is very unlikely I'm going to switch banks unless my current bank really makes me mad, because it's a pain in the butt to switch banks on business accounts when you've got all these automatic payments set up with customers and vendors, and it's a huge ordeal. So that would be a barrier in terms of switching costs. If it's really hard to get access to distribution channels in your industry, that would be a barrier to entry. And if there are other cost disadvantages independent of scale, so sometimes there are just cost disadvantages for other companies that aren't really tied to the size of the business. All of these would affect the threat of new entrants. So here's a question, potential question. So let's say right here in Tulsa, Oklahoma, you're thinking about opening a new pizza joint right here in Tulsa. What do you think? How high do you think the threat of new entrants would be for other pizza competitors if you were opening a pizza joint, right? So I show you here the logo for Upper Crust Pizza, one of the House Smith restaurants. And so how would you explain that using Porter's Five Forces model? Think about that for a second. Well, I would suggest to you that the threat of new entrants in the pizza business would be really high, because it's not that hard to make a pizza. It's not that hard to make a good pizza. Some of you, I worked my way through college managing a pizza joint for many years, and it's just not that hard to make pizza. Now, really good pizza, I have an appreciation for great pizza. I think I mentioned I just got back from Chicago, and we had some great Chicago-style pizza there. But restaurant business in general has a high threat of new entrants. So need to be able to consider whatever business you're analyzing through the model of Porter's Five Forces. So let's look at each one of those components of the Five Forces model. So first, let's look at buyers. Buyers are just customers, right? Buyers have a certain amount of bargaining power, and that can be high or that can be low. I've consulted with a number of companies that sold products from like outdoor sporting goods to different types of products, and they would at some point land a contract with Walmart, and they would think they had won the lottery because they got this huge customer in Walmart. But if you sell to Walmart, Walmart essentially runs your business. They tell you how often you'll ship and what quantities you'll ship and what type of boxes you'll ship. And if they tell you all those metrics are changing tomorrow, they change tomorrow. And if you don't meet the new requirements for delivery, then they'll move on to the next supplier. And so your authors point out here that customer groups or buyer groups have more power when they buy in large volumes. So Walmart would be an example of that, or if you sold to Costco or Target, or something like that, one of the big box stores. Customer groups are powerful if profits are low and switching costs are few, right? So if you're not making a ton of money and it doesn't cost a lot of money for your customers to switch, then customers have more bargaining power. One of the examples you see here, a bowl of raw oatmeal. I'm somebody who I will not pay more money for brand name oatmeal. I just can't tell that much difference between the generic oatmeal, raw oatmeal, and Quaker Oats, right? And so, and maybe there's a difference. Maybe you have a discriminating palate and you'd say, yes, there is a difference. But if Quaker Oats wants to charge more money than the generic oats, I'm not paying it. I'll switch, and there's no switching costs, right? So when profits are low and switching costs are few, customer groups have more power. If your customers can backward integrate, you have less power, right? Customers have more power if they can backward integrate. If they go, you know what? We can backwards engineer and create that product ourselves, that input into what we're buying. And if the customer's quality is not affected by the industry product. Again, I go back to oatmeal, right? I'm like, oats are oats, right? I just can't see the difference. And so I will switch if you try to raise the price of oatmeal on me. And you can probably think of other products like that for you, where you're like, you're just not willing to pay a premium for a higher price. So what affects the bargaining power, the power of suppliers? Supplier groups tend to have more power if there's only a few firms in the industry. If there's not much competition from substitute products, supplier groups have more power. If suppliers sell to several industries, they have more power. If as a customer, the quality of your product is significantly affected by the quality of the raw products you're buying, then suppliers have more power. If products are differentiated and have switching costs, suppliers have more power. Or if forward integration is possible, suppliers have more. So here's an example. One of the companies I worked with, R.L. Hudson, a manufacturing company in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma. They make custom molded rubber and plastic parts for original equipment manufacturers like Volvo, different motorcycle companies, power tool companies, and that type of thing, boat companies. And so there are custom products for each of those original equipment manufacturers. And so if R.L. Hudson makes a rubber hose for an Indian motorcycle, and Indian Motorcycles gets mad, or Victory Motorcycles get mad at R.L. Hudson, they can't just go down to the local parts store and buy that hose. It's a custom molded, designed hose. Now, they could make plans to switch to another supplier, but there would be a longer runway. So again, these are all things that affect the power of suppliers. Make sure you can recognize those. The threat of substitute products and services limit how much money you can charge for your product or service. And so you think about substitutes. If you're in the entertainment industry, maybe you are a venue that hosts concerts. Well, your competition isn't just other venues that host concerts. It's any type of entertainment. It could be theaters where people could go see a movie if they didn't want to come to your concert. It might be casinos where people could go to gamble. It might be sporting events. Those would all be substitute products or services. And so again, substitutes coming from another industry, but kind of perform the same function as what you're selling. And so when there's a threat of substitutes, there's a ceiling or a limit on what you can charge. There, this is maybe, it's hard for you to imagine, but before these Airbnb and Vrbo and that type of thing, probably most motel chains didn't think as individual people renting out rental properties on a daily basis as a threat to the hotel industry, but it's a substitute product, and a lot of people prefer to stay in an Airbnb or a Vrbo when they travel now. Another thing you look at through Porter's Five Forces model is how intense is the rivalry of existing competitors. In some industries, it's not that intense, and in some industries, it's very intense. Some of the industries that I see as being very intense, soft drinks, Coca-Cola, Pepsi, very intense industry, soft drinks. Another industry that's very intense is beers. Miller and Coors, and Modelo, and Budweiser, and all the different beers. Very intense rivalry. Want to get your dollars that you spend on beer, right? For one that I think of are grocery stores. There are very low margins in the grocery business, very low margins. You can't afford to have a lot of product loss if you're in the grocery business through either spoilage or theft because the margins aren't that high. And they're very low switching costs. So I prefer to shop at Reese's. That's just a store that fits me best. They're not the cheapest, but they have good variety and pretty good quality. But if Reese's starts to gouge me and raise prices, I will go somewhere else. I'll go to a Walmart neighborhood market or Aldi's or somewhere, right? But so the rivalry is pretty intense among grocery store chains. And you see here all the different factors that affect rivalry. Probably not a surprise to you, but make sure you would recognize those if you saw them on the exam. It's interesting because sometimes we'll be looking at the general environment and competitive environment. We think, well, how does technology affect our industry or affect our company? And depending on your disposition, you may tend to see the opportunities related to technology, or you may tend to see the threats. But when you look at the different forces in Porter's Five Forces model, technology can be a benefit or a disadvantage to your company and your industry, regardless if we're looking at customers or suppliers or substitutes or rivalry. And so you got to be able to look at both sides of the coin. Again, some people have a negative disposition, see the disadvantages. Some people tend to be positive and see the benefits, but there are both, and you need to be able to recognize both. Now, a disclaimer. Porter's Five Forces models assumes a static model that it's not moving, and that's not the way the world works. Everything is always moving, and it assumes a zero-sum game. But it's still an effective model, effective tool to analyze an industry or the industry that a company is operating in. So it's a useful tool. And you should use it every time you analyze a company. Certainly for this class, you want to use Porter's Five Forces model. Another version of that is this value net extension, and it's just a little bit different. The value net puts substitutes and complements on the horizontal model, and customers and suppliers on the vertical axis. And so you know what complementary products, right? Complementary products are like if you sell smartphones, or let's say iPhones, the apps sold on the App Store would be complementary products. If there are really great apps and apps you can only get on the Apple App Store, then you're more likely to buy an iPhone, right? And so that's a complementary product. If you maybe you're someone that if you go to the movies, you have to have the buttered popcorn at the movies, complementary products. So the more people go to the movies, the more popcorn they sell. Again, we talked about substitutes, the threat of substitutes. Maybe instead of like when we talked about entertainment, there's 100 different types of entertainment, and you can substitute one for another. It's not just sporting events are not just competing with other sporting events. Concerts aren't just competing with other concerts. They're substitutes. And so using this value net is another effective model for analyzing the strategy of a company and looking at the general environment. So, we've talked about the general environment, the competitive environment, and using those tools to analyze it. But you have to think about it in terms of the industry life cycle. Is it in the startup stage of the industry life cycle? Is it the growth phase of the industry life cycle? Is it the maturity phase or decline phase? That affects our industry analysis too. We want to look at trends. Again, it's one thing to take a snapshot of the way things are today in our industry or for our company, but sometimes that isn't enough. We need to see, are things moving upward, getting better, more positive, or are they moving downward, getting worse? And I don't spend a lot of time on the quantitative in this class because you take accounting classes or finance classes, other types of quantitative classes. And so, but it's important when we analyze a company to look at the numbers. And as we do our case analysis in here, the cases will progressively get longer and more complicated and have more data. And you will need to look at those numbers, right? And so look at if our revenue is going up over a period of 5 years, but net income's going down, then what's causing that? It may be a problem or it may not be a problem. It may just be the way it is. But you need to look at the numbers and understand the story that the numbers are telling. The percentages of total sales or total cost. If you're a company and 90% of your sales is dependent on one product or one customer, that's a huge threat to your strategy. Again, understand the numbers that are presented in the cases. Your authors finish up by talking a little bit about strategy groups. Strategy groups within industries are really, within a strategy group, are just companies that tend to be more similar. So no two firms are completely the same and no two firms are completely different. But the more similar they are, clumping those together into what we call strategy groups, either by the geographic area they serve or the type of products they sell or the price point they sell at. You know, some people compete as being the low price or low cost product, and some are high quality, high price. The way they distribute, you can group companies into strategic groups by their distribution method. Are they completely online? Are they brick and mortar? But looking at industry groups can be an effective tool too. You know, if I were to look at a high-end store like Neiman Marcus or some high-end store, that's going to be in a different industry group than Walmart. I can probably buy a pair of jeans at Neiman Marcus or a pair of jeans at Walmart, but they're not in the same strategic group. Again, strategic groups can be great analytical tools because we can look at what's happening in one company and maybe project it to another, kind of see the direction that a particular industry is headed. You see these three retailers listed at the bottom here. When I was a young person, all three of these were very successful major retailers. And now they're either gone or in decline. I mean, find a Sears store. Used to, when I was a young person, we bought everything at Sears. Clothes, tools, appliances, you name it. We bought it at Sears. JCPenney used to have a much broader variety of products they sold than they do now. So again, you can look, these would have probably been clumped into a similar strategic group 20, 30 years ago, and they've endured a similar fate. Here's an example of strategic groups for the automobile industry. So on the vertical axis, we plotted price, and on the horizontal axis, we plotted the breadth of the product line. And so you can see out here in terms of a broad product line and a moderate price, we see the automobile companies we typically think of: Toyota, Ford, GM, Chrysler, Honda, Nissan, right? Strategic group that have a high price but a limited number of products: Ferrari, Lamborghini, Porsche. Companies that have a limited product line and a cheap price: Geely, Tata, Cherry. Again, companies that have a moderate breadth of product line and a higher price: Mercedes, BMW, Audi would probably fall into that strategic group. But anyway, you can kind of use these strategic groups to make decisions. And something to keep in mind, companies change strategic groups. They change strategic groups. When I was in high school, one of my classmates bought the very first Honda automobile in our town that I had ever seen. It looked like this little yellow Honda you see on the slide here. It was a piece of crap. It looked like junk. The engine sounded like a bee in a tin can. You couldn't be more than taller than about 5'5" and fit into it. I thought, what a joke. Who would buy a Honda? Well, I've owned about a dozen Hondas since then. Obviously, Hondas got bigger, their quality. They always had great engines, but they continued to improve the quality and move upstream. And now Honda has their Acura product line, very high-end, very high-quality cars. So Also understand that companies can switch strategic groups, either move up or down along one of these axes into different strategic groups. All right, well, that's chapter 2. Hopefully you got some useful information in there. We certainly presented useful information on how to analyze the external environment, look at the general environment, the competitive environment. How do we apply SWOT analysis to better understand what's going on external to the company, looked at strategic groups. Make sure you know how to use the 5 forces model. And anyway, if you have any questions about any of this, shoot me an email or catch me next time we're in class. I look forward to seeing you in class next time and talking about some of this stuff and applying it in the cases we look at. We'll see you then.